This three-part video series provides an outline of animism and recognises its continuing attraction, explains what it is, describes the animistic worldview, and illustrates some of the practices associated with animism. It looks at expressions of animism in multicultural Australia, and as we explore various aspects of animism, I will present some biblical responses and reflections. And in this first video of the series, we observe animism's continuing attraction and explain what animism is. Animism has a rising presence in Australia. Traditional Aboriginal spirituality is animistic. The traditional religions of tribal peoples who immigrate to Australia, wherever they hail from, will probably be animistic. Just look at this picture. This lady is from the Hmong people, and when the Hmong migrate to Western nations, they will often bring with them animistic beliefs and practices such as ancestor worship. Most of the world's followers of Islam, Buddhism and Hinduism and other religions mix a strong measure of animism with their religious observance. And so animism is bound to rise as increasing numbers of such folk make their home in countries like Australia. In addition to this, we should note also that animism is integral to New Age thinking and practices. Consider the Tasmanian Pagan Alliance's website. It explains that pagans, and I'm quoting here from the website, see divinity expressed in every part of the universe. And we also read on the website, the earth, the planets, the stars and the void are all part of one great divine source to the pagan. And it also says most pagans revere the divine life force which is contained within every part of the universe. There are an increasing number of Australian intellectuals who are committed to an animistic way of viewing the world. Professor Deborah Bird-Rose from the Environmental Humanities Department of the University of New South Wales describes what happened at the funeral of Australian philosopher Val Plumwood. And this is the description she gave. Quote, "As we stood around the open cardboard coffin, a large butterfly flew amongst us and settled on Val's body. It stayed there long enough for us to feel that the moment was truly significant. Then it took wing and disappeared into the forest. We were awed by the connection between Val, the butterfly and the forest. And many of us felt re-inspired to continue her work in the world. This awesome moment was expressive of much of Val's philosophy. We saw before us the intentionality of other creatures, always mysterious, but never mindless. And we experienced ourselves as creatures who are attentive to others and who are participants in the life of the world." Now this echoes the well-known statement of Professor Graham Harvey, a self-confessed pagan, who said that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. And so-called new animists are opposed to treating humans as if we humans are the privileged source of mindfulness in the world. That's something new animists are denying. We're not. Just consider for a moment this diagram. It's from anthropologist who's now deceased, Paul Hebert. And he's expressing something which is basic to biblical thinking. The Bible teaches that there are spiritual powers present in our world, forces which are in conflict. The common Western evacuation of spiritual forces from space is what Paul Hebert calls the excluded middle. Now, most of the world's people strongly believe in a middle zone which is filled with spiritual beings. And this is linked more to the empirical world of humans, animals, plants and matter than with the distant trans-empirical realm of God or ultimate being. Now, so for example, if you go to Myanmar, Burma, there people typically believe that there are 4 kinds of spiritual beings that impact daily life. There are ghosts, there are demons, there are witches, and there are gnats. And it is gnats that dominate Burmese Buddhist behaviour. Gnats may be good or evil. And Burmese people, they request help from the good gnats and seek to appease the evil gnats. It's not people's belief in the presence of spirit beings around them that is the problem. It is people's distorted ways of understanding such beings and the way in which people think of created things in relation to them. Humans in their fallen state have, to quote from Romans chapter 1, exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. The distinction of the Creator from the creation is non-negotiable, and this demands that we distance ourselves from all conceptions of created things that erroneously personalise or divinize them or treat them as subject to powers other than God that can be manipulated for human advancement or security. Let's take a closer look at animism and ask ourselves, what is it? What is animism? How do we define it? What's the best we can do in describing what animism is? Well, animism is the belief that non-human entities possess a spiritual essence. That's one simple way of putting it. Edward Tyler, who lived from 1832 to 1917, is accredited with popularising the term animism. He himself believed that all matter is dead matter, as he called it, and he saw animism as the original error. So he had no space for the excluded middle of Paul Hebert. Now, not all animists believe that everything has a soul, and usually personhood and intentionality and agency are ascribed to non-human entities on a highly selective basis and subject to particular conditions. Indeed, animism also involves belief in impersonal spiritual powers. So this is how Galen van Reenen explains what animism is all about. Animism is the belief that personal spiritual beings and impersonal spiritual forces have power over human affairs, and that human beings must discover what forces are influencing them in order to determine future action and frequently to manipulate their power. Arguably, animism is the default state of the fallen human being. It is natural for those who fail to honour God as their creator to look for extra-human personal relationships. In many societies, this includes treating ancestors as those with whom one can have continuing communication and relationships. Indeed, in African cultures, it is usual to treat ancestors as part of the living community. If you look at this picture, this shows how in Chinese culture an attempt is made to provide good things for deceased ancestors in the afterlife by burning joss paper, that is, paper models of desirables such as houses, cars, mobile phones, and even money, so-called ghost money drawn from the Bank of Hell. And it is common to believe that the spirits of ancestors continue to be present in the natural world, and that they have the power to influence the well-being and the destiny of the living. What are some of the common assumptions that are made by animists? Well, there are a number of these. First of all, we might note that it's assumed that all of life is spiritual, and animists believe that the spirits are everywhere and they control everything or almost everything in life. It's assumed that ancestral spirits control the living. It's assumed that the material world is subservient to the spiritual. It's taken for granted that spiritual power is gained through secret knowledge and magic. It's presupposed that spirits are able to cause sickness. It's also a basic premise of animism that spirits are often evil and unpredictable. And further, it's assumed that particular places have spiritual qualities, special spiritual qualities and powers. Another thing that's basic to the whole way of thinking in animism and the assumptions that are involved is that, what matters is it's not trying to realise some future purpose, but it's about preserving spiritual traditions and dealing with present daily needs. If you look at this picture, just illustrates a Hindu who's praying in the magical waters of the sacred Mother Ganges. He's expecting to get some immediate benefit from doing that. Well, how do we respond to animism from a biblical perspective? Now, there's a great deal that can be said, but I'm going to limit my observations to just three. In the first place, we need to recognise that it is God who has created all life forms, and He is the one who sustains them. Even the inanimate earth and mountains are entirely subject to His sovereign workings. And both these points, that all life forms are sustained by God and that even the inanimate objects are subject to His sovereignty, is brought out in Psalm 104. Just to pick out a few verses from that great psalm, it reads, "These creatures all look to you to give them their food at the proper time. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are satisfied with good things. When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to the dust. When you send your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in His works. He who looks at the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke." In similar fashion, the book of Job, also a book about wisdom, it ends with God interrogating Job and forcing him to come to terms with the immensity and the comprehensiveness of God's sovereign control over the whole earth, including all the natural phenomena and His provision for all living things. Just to pick out one example, at one point God asks Job, "Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread his wings towards the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build his nest at your command?" And the point being made here is that, no, obviously not. It is God who enables every bird and every creature on the face of the earth to move as it does, when it does, and where it goes. And God is even in control of all the chaotic elements of creation that terrify human beings and are beyond their control. And these chaotic elements are epitomised by the mythological Leviathan, which human beings are terrified of. They can't control it, but God controls it. So consequently, biblical Christianity is not deistic. It's not like God has just wound up, he's created the earth and wound it up like a clock and then he stands aside from it and is transcendent in that removed sense. No, not at all. All life is to be explained by the sustaining presence and the sovereign working of God's Spirit. Secondly, God created people in his image. And as Genesis 1 points out, this entails ruling over the created order, not to exploit the creation, but for the good of the creation, to be in his image, like God, the way that God creates the creation for good, the same way so human beings are supposed to act. And so people are rejecting their creator and dehumanizing themselves when they effectively serve that which is created rather than ruling over it. And of course that's the case when people live in fear of forces which are operating in the created order, or for the well-being of themselves and their family and their community, they relate to these forces or beings, as they think of them, as though they were persons that they must somehow placate or please. Thirdly, it's especially the outworking in history of biblical teaching that people are created in God's image, which actually explains the rise of modern science. Because it's precisely this biblical worldview that recognises that humans, while we are part of nature, we also transcend it. And so therefore we are encouraged to objectify nature and created things and to analyse them. And all the more so given that being created in God's image, such approaches are clearly required if we're going to be able to work out how to exercise responsible control over the created order. And by contrast, it is impossible for an animistic worldview to give rise to modern science, since the very worship of nature, along with the practice of magic which it entails, it prevents animists from being able to objectify and analyse nature. So here are three basic observations that we can make from a biblical perspective which highlight some of the inadequacies of the animistic worldview.